We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for?
Those masters of the universe are at it again.
They're not sending their best.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. My name is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center. And today we're going to talk about an important enforcement program that connects local governments to ICE. And it's colloquially known as the 287G program because of the provision in the law that authorizes it. And we have an expert on all things ICE related with us, Jessica Vaughn, our Director of Policy Studies. And if we could start, Jessica, with just what is 287G, why should anybody care about it? And then we'll talk about what's been happening since the Trump administration came in January.
Hi, Mark. Sure. So the 287G program was created back in 1996, but not really used until after 9/11. It is a delegation of authority program whereby ICE can sign an agreement with a local law enforcement agency that essentially allows state or local officers to perform the duties of an ICE officer or ICE agent. This kind of agreement exists in some other forms and other situations, law enforcement situations and agencies, but the 287G program is particular to immigration enforcement. So there are three models that exist. One is called a warrant service officer, where the local officer can basically serve an ICE warrant and also detain and transport an illegal alien. There's the task force model, which in its current form allows an officer on the street, for example, who pulls someone over for some kind of violation. If they are an illegal alien, they can, under ICE's direction, transport someone to the jail based on immigration violations. And then there's what used to be the most common form, but it is no longer the most common form, the jail enforcement model, where officers within the jail have the ability to look up the immigration status of inmates, interview them, make determinations about their status, and even start the deportation process by serving them with immigration charges.
So just to be clear, you've talked about these three different models. First of all, the local officers have to get training, right? In other words, they don't just say, hey, here, we'll pin an ICE badge on your shirt and you're now can do whatever you want. They have to undergo training because ordinarily, a sheriff's deputy somewhere in, Nebraska has no idea about immigration law. So they have to get some training first, right?
Absolutely. And the level of the program that they've signed up for determines how much training they get. So if you're in the jail enforcement model, you're going to have about 4 weeks of training on immigration law and all kinds of issues like, avoiding civil rights violations and,
Sure.
All the nuances of immigration law, the many, many statuses that exist and so on. Or you might have a more simplified version of it if basically your authority extends to just serving an ICE arrest warrant in place of ICE or, picking someone up on the street and transporting them to a jail. But they are trained,
Right.
and also important to understand that they have to work under the supervision of ICE and within ICE's priorities. And that's not usually an issue during a president's administration who's, really prioritizing immigration enforcement as we have now. But there have been times, for example, under the Obama administration and the Biden administration, where the local 287G programs were really frustrated because they were finding all of these illegal aliens that ICE was telling them to take a pass on.
Interesting. Yeah. Now, just to be clear, in this task force model, especially where if an officer stops somebody and can check on their status, these are local law enforcement doing their regular local law enforcement job. It's just that when they intersect with illegal immigrants, in other words, they're not walking around saying, hey, Paco, show me your papers. They're stopping people for drunk driving or arresting people for dealing drugs or whatever it is. And then it turns out that they're illegal aliens. Is that correct?
That's right, to a great extent. It kind of depends on the model that they have. But typically, for example, in the jail, and I visited and observed quite a few 287G programs in operation in jails. And the typical policy that they set up is that they ask everybody about their country of citizenship when they are booked into the jail. And then for the non-citizens, they have the authority to go further and investigate their immigration status. Even if they don't get a detainer automatically from ICE, they can.
But they weren't arrested because of their immigration status. That's kind of my point.
Right. They were arrested for something else and end up in the jail. And then once they're in the jail, the local sheriff's office has the opportunity to work with ICE to figure out what their status is, or look up, they have access to these databases and they can do it themselves, and they know what they're doing. They know how to interview the inmates and so on to act just like an ICE officer in that jail. The new task force program, as it's been called, is police officers or sheriff's deputies out on the street. They pull someone over for something or make an arrest otherwise, for some legitimate local purpose. And then once they have detained the person, then they have the authority under this program to hold the person and ask about their immigration status, and if necessary, take them into the jail if ICE gives the approval.
Right. And in a sense, I mean, this is sort of just to kind of place this whole concept in context, it's sort of the polar opposite of a sanctuary policy. In other words, you could have jurisdictions that are not sanctuaries but are not 287G either. But this is kind of literally the opposite. Sanctuary policy is, they don't cooperate with ICE and they'll let illegal aliens back onto the street to continue victimizing the immigrants they live among. And then the opposite is 287G, where they're cooperating in a kind of, not just cooperating with ICE, but in a sense, partly integrating their processes with ICE.
That's right. And this is one of those classic win-win kind of programs where they are making sure that criminal aliens are not going to fall between the cracks. The 287G program was created originally because there were a lot of local law enforcement agencies that were frustrated that ICE was never getting around to picking up the criminal aliens that they were finding through their law enforcement duties. That ICE just didn't have the personnel or the resources to get to every criminal alien who was arrested. So it gave the locals the authority to kind of be an extension of ICE. And this is great for ICE too, because it is a true force multiplier and, allows them to be a presence in more places around the country than they could otherwise cover with their limited staff.
Now, the one thing, and this relates generally to this issue of detainers or anything ICE does with people arrested on local criminal charges, deportation is not punishment. It's just an administrative question of where you're going to be. So is this a way, and this is kind of a sort of devil's advocate question, but is this really sort of a way of criminals avoiding punishment? Or is it the case that if the locals want to prosecute, you're still going to jail? It's just that when they're done with you, then they hand you over to ICE.
No, ICE's longstanding policy is that they want all criminals, including the criminals who are illegal aliens, to be held accountable for whatever crimes they commit and are convicted for here. And they are not going to take custody, and they're going to tell the people in the 287G programs that, we're not going to take custody until after this person serves their sentence and then they will start the removal process. But the thing is ICE can't be in every jail in every county in the country. So this, allows someone else who's been trained and been given delegation of authority to actually serve the arrest warrant or the removal warrant. And also to identify some of those cases that ICE might not pick up on because maybe it's someone who was a gotaway and there's no record of them in the DHS system. In those jails that have the 287G authority, they can interview the person and figure out, someone who identifies as a non-citizen, they can figure it out and be really, expand ICE's presence all over the country.
And there are going to be instances as well, right, where the local police or sheriff's department arrests somebody and maybe the district attorney doesn't want to prosecute him, or the evidence was corrupted somehow and they're not likely to get a prosecution. So in a sense, they're using ICE as a sort of a backstop for their purposes for, prosecution, or basically their public safety. It's kind of a backstop for public safety.
Yes, because there are a lot of places where somebody might be released. Like, for example, in Massachusetts, there have been times where people have been arrested on charges of rape, but they're still released by the local judge, or, drug trafficking, or, a number of other offenses that a lot of us would kind of, our eyebrows would rise and go, gosh, you're letting that person back on the streets. And if ICE issues a detainer, or a local officer acting with 287G authority issues a detainer, that person who is by definition a flight risk. I would argue that pretty much almost every illegal alien is going to be a flight risk and should not be allowed to bail out. They can be held on immigration violations while they're awaiting the disposition of their case. And that ensures that they're actually going to trial for rape or, drug dealing or whatever it is. And so, I would argue that it makes it more likely that the person is going to see justice. Now, there are situations where ICE, doesn't want to turn people back over to the locals because they're a sanctuary policy and they know they're going to release them, or, somehow in other ways protect them. And so they may not want to give that person back. But those are only in the most egregious sanctuary jurisdictions. And they're not going to do it for, the real serious offenders. They're not going to deport a rapist out from under rape charges somewhere, but they might if it's, a DUI or something like that, where they know the person's going to be in the wind unless they deport them.
Interesting. So in a lot of cases, in a sense, they'll be in ICE custody twice. In other words, ICE might hold on to them while they're waiting for trial. And then if they go to trial and are convicted, ICE would, hand them back to the custody of the state to serve a prison sentence, and then they get them back, in a sense. So I hadn't really thought of that. That's interesting.
Yeah, and there are some cases like people who've been deported multiple times. ICE may want to charge them and send them to federal prison.
Right, because it's a felony to return after you've been deported. And so, yeah, that's true. So they could be they could have been arrested for a relatively minor crime, but then ICE finds out they're actually a federal felon. Interesting. So I want to talk about how it's expanded and what the issues are there. But one question I had is, and you kind of referred to this by using the sheriff's department example, are 287G programs more likely to be entered into by sheriff's departments than police departments? Or is it just a question of there's a lot more sheriff's departments? Or are there? I don't know. In other words, is there some difference between city police and county sheriffs in working with 287G?
Well, in the past, there always were more sheriff's departments who signed up for 287G. And that was because the main use of it was in the jails, and sheriffs run the jails.
Okay. Right, of course.
But now ICE has created a new version of it that they're calling the task force program that does allow an officer working on the street, police officers also, or sheriff's deputies who are doing, who in some places they're like the office, like a police force. They can now get this authority to use, in traffic stops and other scenarios before someone is actually booked into jail. So that is something new. In the past, it was mostly the jails.
So, I mean, of these different models, it seems like the jail model, where there's would be kind of more efficient in the sense of the sort of illegal aliens per man hour sort of thing, because in a sense they're all there in one place and you're just processing them. Is the jail model preferable, or are they all kind of, they serve different purposes?
I think the jail enforcement model is very useful, and a lot more places ought to take a look at it. But really, all of these are good extensions of ICE authority and very helpful to the locals to make sure that people are not falling between the cracks.
Right.
Right now, there are more task force programs, the street programs. Some also call them tactical, which I think is probably a better name for it than task force.
Right.
The tactical programs now outnumber each of the other two models.
Interesting. You would have thought the jail model, though, would be kind of the least, I don't know, either controversial or least problematic, or maybe even least burdensome for local officials. In other words, it's the easiest thing to do. Their guys on the street aren't doing anything different. It's just that, and you have to book people once they're in the jail. So it's just another step in the booking process, as it were. I don't know. My sense would always be that the doing the 287G process in a jail would be the almost like the path of least resistance for a lot of these jurisdictions.
Well, I agree with you. Once someone is booked into a jail, this is after they've been arrested, and
right.
Someone decided that it was worth booking them into jail.
Right.
And there's time to deal with them. You can't really accuse them of racial profiling or abuse of authority or anything like that. In fact, there hasn't been much of that anyway, but there have been a lot of accusations of it. It's worth mentioning, too, that ICE audits all of these agreements every other year. They have to go through an audit to examine any allegations of abuse of authority and racial profiling and so on. And they look at all their statistics and cases and all. So, I mean, I'm not aware of any substantiated claim of racial profiling ever in the history of the 287G program, because the training is so extensive. But yeah, you're the one that's the least susceptible to that is going to be the jail model, as opposed to the the tactical model.
So briefly, what happened with 287G under the Biden administration? Because we know they basically put up a welcome sign at the border for illegal aliens, but 287G is an interior program. Did they basically gut it or ignore it, or what happened under Biden? And then obviously the sequel is what's been happening since January.
Well, under the Biden administration, they refused to accept any new applications for 287G agreements. They didn't spend any money on it. Those programs that were in existence, they subjected them to the same enforcement priorities, which is, limited to the most serious offenders. And even then often were allowed to escape arrest for deportation. So it was very, very limited. They were subject to this suppression of interior enforcement. And not only that, they also targeted several of the 287G programs for termination based on some pretty dubious claims of abuse. For example, a program up in Massachusetts, in Bristol County, a lot of the immigration inmates complained about the sheriff, even though they were behaving pretty badly in prison. And it's pretty clear that it was all, sort of concocted in order to give the Justice Department the opportunity to cancel a program that had been considered previously a model for a lot of other programs. But
interesting.
ICE under Biden was very susceptible to political pressure from allies in places like Massachusetts against these programs.
It's a very generous way to put it, quite frankly. But yes, go ahead.
So it did fall into disuse and was not really helping with enforcement that much. I mean, there were some programs have continued, and they did the best job they could. under these conditions, and they still felt it was useful for public safety because, they had good working relationships with their local ICE field offices that gave them a little bit more wiggle room to really get some things done. But it was a shadow of its former self. And especially when you're not taking any new agreements, you're not spending any money on it. All of that has changed now. The 287G program has exploded. One of the very first things that the Trump administration wanted to do was bring in these local partners so that they could help with the huge task of deportation now. And now we've gone from something, I think under Biden, it was maybe like 43 active agreements. As of the end of May, there are 635 active 287G agreements in 40 states. And the state of Texas just recently passed a bill to make it mandatory for every county in Texas to have a 287G program, as Florida has done. And that's going to bring on another 254 agreements.
Wow.
So it's really expanded. And of these, 100 are the full jail model. 288 are the warrant service officer programs, which are very basic. It's basically just, when ICE issues a detainer, this officer can serve it to make sure the person isn't released. So that's a very basic model. But surprisingly to me, there are now 307 of the tactical agreements in 30 states, which is the street model. And they've, at the pressing of Texas, they now are going to have to work hand in hand with a jail warrant service officer, and they have the authority to detain and transport them from where they were arrested, wherever out on the street, back to the jail. So this is going to be really helpful for the local authorities and great for ICE because it doesn't have to be all places at all times.
Right. So, and now, we're talking, if just sort of in my head, that's like a 15-fold increase in the number of agreements and then more coming online. And this is in a period of 4 months. So this is the kind of thing that will take a little while to show results, though, right? Because you got a lot of people you have to train. You can't train them all at once. So, in other words, would we expect to see real results from this soon, a couple of months from now, by the end of the year? What's your sense, since this isn't something you can just switch on like a light switch?
Well, we are seeing some results already, particularly in Florida, where not only does every county sheriff have this, but also a number of the state law enforcement agencies like Fish and Wildlife, the Agricultural Enforcement Agency, the state troopers, and a bunch of other state law enforcement agencies. And they, because they're using these sort of 287G light type of programs, the tactical and the warrant service, the training is much shorter, and they're able to do a lot of it online, which is really helpful to these agencies. They don't have to lose officers, to go send them somewhere to be trained for this. ICE has become much more nimble in getting these partners online, like out there with the authority and, ready to use it. And we're seeing some big numbers of arrests out of Florida now. And apparently a lot of them have to do with having the 287G authority, to facilitate their ability to work with ICE. And to really, what really it boils down to is, ICE now has much more manpower on the street to do this.
Right, yeah, de facto leverages their manpower. So Florida's all over this. You said Texas just passed legislation to this effect. Why aren't other red states doing this? Why isn't South Carolina doing this? Why isn't, Montana or Iowa doing? This seems like an obvious thing. Is there resistance, or are they not thinking about it? Is ICE not marketing this as effectively? What's your sense?
Well, what I've noticed in South Carolina is that a number of places that had it years ago and dropped it out of frustration because of the priorities imposed on ICE under Obama and Biden, they dropped out of it. they already are back on board. Like they were among the first ones on January 21st to sign up again with ICE. And not only that, they've talked a lot of their colleagues, other sheriffs into signing up for it. So they are increasing the numbers. It's just, with Florida and Texas, I think showing the way with a state law that says you must do this. It's like not only are they not sanctuaries, they are telling their law enforcement agencies that they have to do this under state law. And if more states did that, certainly we'd see a lot more of these agreements. It has always been considered a voluntary program in the statute, but of course, like with E-Verify, states can pass laws to make it mandatory.
Yeah, it seems like this would be a real priority at the state level for, activists and politicians and stuff to get this kind of thing passed in other states, right?
Yes. I mean, if you can pass something like this in Texas, where there has been some resistance within the state legislature to doing interior enforcement types of initiatives.
From the Chamber of Commerce types, basically.
Right. And in Texas, this legislation was spearheaded by former Sheriff A.J. Louderback, who was one of the people leading the push for 287G in Texas all along. And, knew how the program had to work, was able to convince his colleagues. He's now in the legislature and, was able to get a good bill through that had to go through some different iterations. But having someone in law enforcement who knows how this works would be really helpful to convince the state legislatures to do this. A big issue has been money, frankly. Both Florida and Texas are providing money to support these local agreements, and not all states have done that.
I see.
ICE has not always had the money either to supervise it because the local field offices have to devote resources to actually supervising all these programs.
Of course. Yeah, I see. And so the big, beautiful bill might help in that regard if it ever gets passed.
It definitely would. I mean, there's $650 million allocated to 287G programs in particular, which is like 10 times they've ever had in the federal spending bill. So that's really a good thing for this program.
So one of the concerns I remember you mentioned to me is that there's a lot of jurisdictions, but it's to some degree a mile wide and an inch deep. In other words, that this should be more sort of a deeper cooperation. Now, what did you mean by that? Is ICE pushing the more superficial versions of 287G, or are those just the ones that are more appealing to local jurisdictions? In other words, how can this be sort of deepened?
Yeah, I think ICE's priority right now is to boost its arrest numbers. They're looking for something like 3,000 a day, and they can't do it on their own. They need other partners to help them. And there are, it's a target-rich environment pretty much everywhere.
Sure. With
the explosion in illegal immigration in the last few years. But, there's the real concern that there are going to be lots and lots of arrests, but the ICE is not going to be able to keep up with actual removals. So that, They need to be also thinking about, what happens after we get all these arrests. And there's the worry that they're going to run into or run out of detention space, end up releasing criminal aliens that have been arrested all over the place, have delays in actually getting removal orders. Right now, there are many, many outstanding, unexecuted final orders of removal, and many of them are criminals. So that's kind of the low-hanging fruit that ICE is going after right now. But at a certain point, I think that they're going to have to look at these deeper forms of 287G. Years ago, I was able to obtain an ICE document that showed that in its heyday in 2008, 2009, when ICE was really pushing 287G like they are today, 20% of all ICE removals were 287G initiated. So that's 1/5 of their caseload. But back then, what was different was they didn't have as many agreements, but they did have them in the big jails like Harris County Jail, which is Houston, Los Angeles County, San Bernardino, Riverside, San Diego, all these big...
All sanctuaries now, right?
Yes, and places where, and Mecklenburg County, which is Charlotte in North Carolina, a bunch of counties around the Atlanta area had 287G programs that were the full jail model, where they were really doing all the processing and selecting cases. I think ICE is going to have to look at regaining agreements in places like that to really boost its numbers. And also, I think they're going to have to look at ways to delegate authority for the whole deportation process. In other words, accept help from states in detention and getting orders of removal and actually flying people out. And that is possible under federal law, but they have to take advantage of it. And we've seen states like Florida, for example, has come up with a plan for how they could do that. And, I think ICE is going to need to accept help on more than just arresting. And then for the long term, they're going to have to go beyond. There were some really successful task force agreements back in the day that allow local authorities to address problems related to illegal immigration that exist uniquely in their area, like whether it's human smuggling, human trafficking, ID theft, illegal employment. There's a model that was in existence back in the late 2000s that worked really well, where and they called it the task force model, where the local authorities could actually investigate and prosecute cases that were really part of the infrastructure of illegal immigration. Like I said, they were gone after all the ID theft. Colorado pretty much shut down alien smuggling in the state with this task force authority, an investigative authority that let them set the priorities for what kinds of cases they were looking for. Alabama had it in the motor vehicle department to catch people trying to apply for driver's licenses, really kind of helping make sure that it was, that criminal aliens and illegal aliens committing crimes to try to stay in the country, all that would be shut down. And even going after employers in South Carolina, they went after illegal employment using 287G authority. So I hope they'll move beyond it.
So this would be even more explicitly saying, here's a tool. You pick the priority in your local state, your jurisdiction or your state, and this is a tool you can use to achieve that priority, basically.
Exactly. It's not led by ICE, just supervised by ICE, for the details of immigration enforcement, but the priorities would be set by the locals. And that's really why 287G was created to begin with, to be something that helped the state agencies deal with illegal immigration, not just to be an extension of ICE.
I mean, not to create more work for ICE, but is in getting that kind of, sort of deeper cooperation, is this the kind of thing where ICE could come up with a template in marketing 287G and say, look, here is what Florida did, and, changing what needs to be changed according to your state's statutes, here's the model. And, we're happy to work with you. In other words, almost sort of market it more. Because, I don't know, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I get a sense ICE is sort of having people come in and apply for 287G rather than proactively going out and saying, here's how you guys can use it. Here's the template, and we're here to help.
Right, to be more strategic about where they're pushing these agreements. I think right now, to be fair to ICE, they're like dealing with these states that have just said, okay, we're all doing it. We're all going to have to do it.
Right.
They have to manage that. But I think in the longer term, they're going to have to be flexible enough to sell it to places that have not looked at 287G, and found political difficulties with it or whatever. And I think actually the effective marketing is going to come from the local agencies that are using it, within their professional associations,
word of mouth.
like at the National Sheriff's Association or the Chiefs of Police Association. They're going to have to tell the story about how this worked well for them on the problems that they identified.
Or the DMV Association. I'm sure there's a state association of DMV directors. Yeah, interesting. So it seems to me that for listeners who aren't working for ICE and so aren't making decisions there, but there is still a role here for people, because pressuring, or at least not even pressuring, suggesting at your local level that your local law enforcement agency explore 287G agreements, and potentially for state legislators to introduce legislation to mandate 287G use by jurisdictions, since all counties and cities are creations of the state legislatures. They have authority to require this in the way you said Texas recently did. So it seems to me those are takeaways for listeners that pretty much anybody can deal with, even if they're not, in ICE. Any last thoughts on this?
Well, yes. I mean, to your point, ICE has made it really easy for people to find out about the program, and also for law enforcement agencies to sign up for it. There's a link on their 287G page on the ICE website, ice.gov, where you just click on it and can send an email to inquire about it. And I was impressed to see that they have another link titled How to Talk to Your Sheriff About Getting a 287G Program. And they have educational materials, which I think is really great for people to take to their sheriffs, or even, their county boards, or, whoever they think might be interested in this. It's good for, really every law enforcement agency in the country ought to have it. I hope we'll get to that, but it's going to take time for that. And, it'd be good to be at the front of the line.
Right. So we'll include in the show notes a link to the sort of main 287G page over at ICE. Thank you, Jessica, and we'll presumably be talking about this more in the future. And I think this was actually, I learned a few things myself. So this was a interesting exploration of 287G and how locals and ICE can work together to promote both public safety at the local level and immigration integrity at the national level. So thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Finally today, I wanted to just briefly note that the Maryland man is back. This is Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the person that the anti-borders people have turned into some kind of poster child, who was erroneously deported to El Salvador, is back in the United States, but not exactly the way his supporters may have intended. He has been indicted for alien smuggling, and while legally speaking, there's still a presumption of innocence, that body cam video from a stop in Tennessee where he was, transporting a whole bunch of people who had no luggage and no tools and no nothing. It was pretty, in a car that it turns out was owned by a convicted alien smuggler. Pretty damning evidence. So he may well end up spending some time in jail here before he's deported, but he's going to end up getting deported one way or the other. One of the things that occurred to me is that I think both the administration and its opponents kind of initially reacted incorrectly, I think, to this instance. In other words, I think the administration kind of dug its heels in after all of the Maryland man nonsense, rather than just bring him back, detain him, and either face, file charges against him then, or do the immigration work of lifting the statutory withholding of removal that a judge, I think, incorrectly had given him, and then deport him. But I think the bigger mistake was on the opponents of the president and opponents of immigration enforcement, who turned Abrego Garcia into some kind of Eagle Scout, when in fact it turns out, even then we knew that he was a wife beater. It turns out he's an alien smuggler, and there are at least allegations that are not included, at least yet, in the indictment, that he also smuggled guns illegally and drugs and may have been involved in some other things as well. So the opponents of the president and the supporters of Abrego Garcia would have done a lot better to say, look, this guy is no Eagle Scout, and maybe he should be deported, but we have rules and we should follow the rules. Something of that nature would have made a lot more sense on their part. And now, they're going to end up with this egg on their face because they haven't talked about him in a long time, because as more and more information comes out about how this guy really is an undesirable, they're kind of stuck, having lionized him as the Maryland dad and Maryland man. So one of the things I think that the lesson from this is, don't jump to either oppose or support some person involved in immigration issues until you know more details, because there's always more that's going to come out, and always makes sense to wait for the facts before you, as Senator Van Hollen from Maryland did, essentially make a fool of yourself by, going down and having margaritas with this guy and talking about, let's free Kilmar and the rest of it. So anyway, I think that's wise advice in general for any side of any issue. And with that bit of advice, this is Mark Krikorian signing off for Parsing Immigration Policy. Thank you to Brian Griffith, our producer, for making this work. Thanks to all of you for listening. If your podcast platform allows you to rate or review the podcast, please do so. It definitely helps us. And I hope to see you on our next episode.